The world of the early 1900s was full of confidence and pride. Nations were growing richer, cities were expanding, and technology was changing life faster than ever before. The telephone, the airplane, and the automobile made people feel unstoppable. Europe stood at the center of it all, a continent of mighty empires and long histories, full of kings, crowns, and powerful armies. But beneath that pride, something dangerous was brewing, a mix of rivalry, ambition, and fear that was waiting for just one spark. That spark came on a sunny day, June 28, 1914, in a city called Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, had traveled there with his wife, Sophie. They came to inspect the army, unaware that several young men were hiding among the cheering crowds, men who wanted to strike for a cause called Serbian nationalism. As the Archduke's car drove through the streets, one of them, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, pulled a pistol and fired 2 shots. The Archduke and his wife fell dead. Those 2 gunshots would echo across the entire world. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia and demanded justice. Serbia agreed to some terms, but not all. Behind the scenes, other nations were already choosing sides. Germany promised to support Austria-Hungary no matter what. Russia swore to protect Serbia. France had an alliance with Russia. Britain stood close to France. Within weeks, the nations of Europe began to mobilize their armies. What should have been a small regional conflict exploded into something the world had never seen before. In August 1914, Germany declared war on Russia and France, and soon invaded Belgium, a small neutral country, in order to reach France faster. Britain, outraged by the attack on Belgium, declared war on Germany. Within days, the entire continent was at war. From the muddy plains of Belgium to the forests of Eastern Europe, millions of young men were marching, some with excitement, others with fear. They were told it would be quick, that they'd be home by Christmas. But by Christmas, most of them were either buried in cold fields or trapped in endless trenches. The early months of the war were chaotic. Germany swept through Belgium and northern France, pushing the Allies back toward Paris. But the French army, refusing to surrender their capital, made a desperate stand along the Marne River in September 1914. For the first time, the German advance was stopped. Both sides dug trenches, long lines of mud and wire that stretched from the North Sea all the way to the Swiss border. Soldiers would live, fight, and die in those trenches for the next 4 years. Life in the trenches was a nightmare. The ground was soaked with rain and blood. The air smelled of gunpowder, sweat, and rot. Rats grew as big as cats, feeding on corpses left between the lines. Soldiers slept beside their rifles, soaked in mud, waiting for the next attack. Every day they faced machine gun fire, artillery shells, and poison gas that burned their lungs. No one who went into battle came back the same. Yet, even in that misery, friendships were born, bonds between men who had nothing but each other. The war spread far beyond Europe. In Africa, colonies belonging to Britain, France, and Germany became battlefields. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire joined the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The deserts of Arabia became a new front. British officer T. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, helped lead Arab tribes in revolt against Ottoman rule. In Asia, Japan joined the Allies and seized German territories in the Pacific. What had started as a European war was now a global one. In 1915, new horrors appeared. The Germans introduced poison gas on a large scale, and the Allies soon used it too. Clouds of green chlorine drifted across no man's land, searing lungs and blinding eyes. At the same time, the Allies tried to break the stalemate with massive offensives. One of the most infamous was the Battle of the Somme in 1916. On the first day alone, more than 57,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded, the bloodiest day in British military history. The front hardly moved. Meanwhile, far to the east, the Russians were fighting the Germans and Austro-Hungarians across vast distances. The Russian army was huge but poorly equipped. Millions of peasants were sent to the front with little training and sometimes without rifles. The strain of war began to tear Russia apart. By 1917, anger and hunger boiled over into revolution. Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, and soon after, the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin took power. They made peace with Germany, pulling Russia out of the war. At the same time, across the Atlantic, the United States had been watching. President Woodrow Wilson had promised to keep America out of the war, but German actions began to change that. German submarines, called U-boats, were sinking ships without warning, even ones carrying civilians. Then a secret message called the Zimmermann telegram was intercepted. It showed Germany trying to convince Mexico to attack the U.S. in exchange for American territory. The American public was furious. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. The entry of the United States brought fresh energy to the exhausted Allies. American troops, called doughboys, began arriving in Europe in 1918. They were young, eager, and well-supplied, and they helped turn the tide. Germany, facing shortages and rebellion at home, made one last desperate offensive in the spring of 1918. For a moment, they seemed unstoppable, but the Allies held firm. By summer, German forces were pushed back. Cities and villages that had been under occupation for years were finally freed. By the autumn of 1918, the Central Powers were collapsing one by one. Bulgaria surrendered first. Then the Ottoman Empire sought peace. Austria-Hungary broke apart as its many ethnic groups declared independence. And in Germany, revolution erupted. The Kaiser fled into exile. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns finally went silent. Soldiers on both sides stood in disbelief. After 4 years of unimaginable suffering, the Great War was over. But the world it left behind was unrecognizable. More than 16 million people were dead, both soldiers and civilians. Entire towns had been wiped off the map. Fields that once grew wheat were filled with shell craters and bones. The economies of Europe were shattered. Millions of soldiers returned home with missing limbs, haunted eyes, and memories they could never erase. The world had seen the worst of itself, and nothing would ever be the same again. In 1919, the victors gathered in Paris to decide the future. The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh penalties on Germany, massive reparations, loss of territory, and humiliation. The Allies hoped this would ensure peace. But the treaty also planted seeds of bitterness that would grow into something even darker 2 decades later. Many Germans felt betrayed and angry. Among them was a young veteran named Adolf Hitler, who would soon rise from those ashes and lead the world into another, even deadlier war. The First World War destroyed 4 great empires: the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian. It redrew borders, toppled kings, and gave birth to new nations. It introduced modern warfare, tanks, airplanes, machine guns, and gas, and showed the world the terrifying power of industrial destruction. It also changed societies. Women entered factories to replace men at war. Medical advances were made in treating wounds and disease. But the psychological scars ran deep. They called it shell shock, then what we now call trauma. Entire generations were lost, and poets, artists, and writers tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. Even in the darkest times, small sparks of humanity shone through. On Christmas Eve, 1914, along the Western Front, British and German soldiers called a brief truce. They sang carols, exchanged small gifts, and even played football in the frozen mud. For one night, the war stopped. The next morning, the killing resumed. That moment remains one of the most haunting symbols of how close peace and war can exist within the same human heart. But even as Europe mourned, new forces were reshaping it. The old empires had fallen. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, once stretching across half of Central Europe, was gone, replaced by smaller nations: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire had collapsed, leaving behind the modern states of Turkey and much of the Middle East divided between Britain and France. The Russian Empire was replaced by a new power, the Soviet Union, born out of revolution and civil war. The German Empire had vanished too, replaced by the fragile Weimar Republic, burdened with debt and humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was supposed to bring peace. Instead, it left bitterness. Germany was forced to accept full blame for the war, pay enormous reparations, and give up vast territories. Its people felt betrayed, not only by their enemies, but by their own leaders. The treaty, meant to stop future wars, instead planted the seeds of the next one. Nationalism festered. Resentment grew. And in the shadows of economic hardship, dangerous ideologies began to take root. Beyond politics, the war changed culture itself. Artists, poets, and writers who had witnessed the front tried to capture what they had seen, but words often failed. The poetry of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon spoke of horror and futility, of young men sent to die for empty glory. Painters like Otto Dix and Paul Nash filled their canvases with distorted landscapes and broken bodies. The war had stripped away the romantic image of heroism. It showed war for what it truly was: chaos, pain, and loss. Technology, too, had changed forever. The war had introduced tanks, airplanes, submarines, and chemical weapons, inventions that would redefine modern warfare. The skies were no longer safe. For the first time, civilians looked up and feared bombs falling from above. The sea, too, was deadly, as silent U-boats hunted merchant ships beneath the waves. The modern world had discovered a terrifying truth: humanity's inventions could destroy as easily as they could create. The role of women changed dramatically during the war. As millions of men went to the front, women took their places in factories, farms, and offices. They built weapons, drove ambulances, and served as nurses near the battlefields. Their hard work kept nations alive. When the war ended, they were no longer willing to return quietly to the shadows. In many countries, including Britain and the United States, women gained the right to vote soon after. The war had opened doors that would never fully close again. Meanwhile, outside Europe, the effects of the war were just as profound. In colonies across Africa and Asia, thousands of men had been sent to fight for empires that barely acknowledged their existence. They returned home with new ideas of freedom, equality, and independence. The seeds of decolonization had been planted. Leaders in India, Africa, and the Middle East began to question why they should die for empires that saw them as second-class citizens. Decades later, those questions would grow into full-blown independence movements. In the 1920s, the world tried to heal. There was jazz and dancing, new art and new inventions. Airplanes crossed oceans, radios carried voices across continents, and people dared to dream again. But beneath that glittering surface, the pain of the past never truly left. Europe was still drowning in debt. Millions were unemployed. Inflation ate away at savings. And in Germany, humiliation turned to anger. Out of that anger rose men who promised to restore pride. Men like Adolf Hitler. The Great War had ended, but its shadow stretched long into the future. It had rewritten maps, toppled empires, and reshaped societies. But perhaps its greatest impact was on the human soul. It had shown how fragile civilization could be, how quickly reason could be drowned out by hatred and fear. The people who lived through it learned that progress and destruction often walked hand in hand. For historians, World War I remains a turning point, the moment the modern world was born. Before it, wars were fought with cavalry and flags. After it, they were fought with machines and gas masks. Before it, Europe ruled the world. After it, its dominance began to fade. Before it, the world believed in glory. After it, the world believed in survival. Even today, over a century later, the scars remain. Fields in France and Belgium still yield rusted helmets, unexploded shells, and bones of the fallen. Poppies bloom over those same fields each spring, bright red, like drops of blood on green grass. The poppy became the symbol of remembrance, a promise to never forget. On every November 11th, people around the world pause for a moment of silence, remembering the millions who never came home. When you think of World War I, don't just think of battles and generals. Think of the young men writing letters home, the nurses holding dying hands, the families waiting by candlelight for news that never came. Think of the world that vanished, a world of kings and empires, of old certainties and blind pride. Think of the courage it took to endure it, and the cost humanity paid to learn its lesson. The Great War began with a gunshot in Sarajevo and ended with the reshaping of the entire planet. It taught us that pride can destroy nations, that peace is fragile, and that once the drums of war begin to beat, they are almost impossible to silence. And though another world war would follow, more devastating than the first, the story of 1914 to 1918 remains a warning carved into history. A warning that behind every flag and anthem, behind every declaration of honor and glory, there are human lives waiting to be lost. So when we remember World War I, we remember not just how it started or how it ended, but what it revealed about us, our strength, our cruelty, our endurance, and our hope. Because even in the mud and fire of the trenches, among the cries and the silence, humanity endured. And from that endurance came a promise that still matters today: never again.